Welcome to In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson. Today our guest is Rick Reibstein, who is a Lexington resident and an attorney who teaches environmental law at BU and has taught at some other universities. He also is on the local Sustainable Lexington Committee and has worked for the state of Massachusetts with companies to try to reduce the amount of pollution that the companies produce. So we're going to be talking about all those things today and other things as well. And thank you for coming on, Rick.
Oh, this is great.
Did I get all that correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. So thanks for coming on. Maybe first we could touch on your local activities with Sustainable Lexington. What is that committee devoted to, and what have you been doing to help them out?
Well, I want to start out by noting the incredible contribution to our town by a guy named Mark Sandine.
We've had Mark on here.
You have had Mark on?
He's quite a guy.
Yeah, he's quite amazing. Yeah. He is in the solar business, and he knows it cold, and he's devoted a lot of time to helping this town install solar devices. And there are other members on the committee that bring powerful experiences to the task, Dan Voss and Todd Rhodes, and I'm not going to remember everybody's name right now.
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
Right. But it's a wonderful thing that these people volunteer their time, and so we now have solar installations at the town landfill, and well, it's no longer a landfill. The town composting center is how I think about it,
right.
And it's contributing a substantial benefit to our bottom line as well as to our sustainability performance. And when I came on the committee, I used to work at EPA, and I was recommended by a colleague who was on the committee but was leaving town. He said I should come on and try to replace him, he's irreplaceable. But I did my best.
Who was that person?
That was Ken Moraff.
Oh, I know the name. I've never met him, but okay, thank you.
He's moved to, I think, Arlington.
Okay.
Yeah, still producing good work for the nation at EPA.
Okay.
And for his town.
Okay.
What I tried to bring was a new perspective on toxics, because that was my experience in working for the state. I was an official of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for 27 years in something called the Toxics Use Reduction Program, which a lot of people don't know about. So can we talk about that?
We can. I had never heard of it until you mentioned it to me earlier, and I think it's very much worth talking about.
Yeah. So TURA, Toxics Use Reduction Act, was passed unanimously by the legislature in 1989. How many laws are passed unanimously?
Very few.
And I point that out because it just makes common sense. And what it is the idea that companies should think before they choose to use a toxic chemical, or should think about one they've already chosen to use, and consider whether there might be alternatives. That's pretty much it. The law requires them to do what they call planning, where they actually have to do a formal process of thinking about it. But the law does not require anyone to stop using chemical X if they like chemical X. It just says, would you please think about it? Mm-hmm. And that's the regulatory part of the law.
The law requires that they do that.
The law requires that they go through that process. They have a third party certified that they've done the process. A chief official at the company has to certify that they've done the process, so they sign on the line. And they also have to pay us a fee for using the toxic. So all these things are to make them think about it. And it also provides the funding for the program, which is important because otherwise it might be eliminated when a new administration comes in.
You're saying that the fee the companies pays for the program?
That's right. Yeah. And part of what it pays for is an assistance service. Mm-hmm. That's what I helped create and run for 27 years. And that is called the Office of Technical Assistance. So one of the interesting things is that this office is not well known because we worked confidentially. I can't say we anymore, but the office is still in existence. Mm-hmm. And the services are provided confidentially to a company. So if you think about it, it has to be that way, because if you're a company using toxic chemicals, and I say, hey, I'm from the government, I'd like to help you not use so many toxic chemicals. You might say, well, if you come visit my factory and you see that I'm violating a law, you're from the government, you're going to fine me.
Right.
And then there are many programs like this all across the country, and in many of them they say, don't worry about it, I won't. And then you have to decide whether you trust that or not.
The company has to decide.
Right. And maybe you don't get much business. In the Toxic Use Reduction Act, confidentiality was actually legislated.
Okay.
So we can say it's in the law, unless there's an emergency, I'm not allowed to tell people about violations that I see unless they're an imminent threat to health and safety.
Sure.
So we would go in with that promise, and we would actually see what's going on. And you have to contrast this with other programs that provide such advice. So this whole approach of trying to avoid the use of toxics was very popular at the end of the 80s.
Okay.
It's called pollution prevention, and internationally they often call it cleaner production.
Okay.
But those terms can include a lot of things. And Massachusetts' focus on the decision to use the toxics is, I think, a very good focus, because it really focuses you. And when we go in and we tell companies that there are different options to do this, and they're not worried about us telling on them, we actually see what's going on. And the other programs that can't get on site can only give general advice.
I see.
So we'll see that you're using chemical X in a particular way, and that helps us to actually give you good advice that works for you.
Right.
If we couldn't get on site and we could only say, well, there are different things you could do with chemical X, you'd probably look at it and go, well, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that. And often the ideas need a lot of development so that they can work for the situation. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the advice that we give isn't really on point, but it gets people thinking. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you one example. We went into a company that had a huge amount of waste plastic that they couldn't reuse. And we said, well, after we did some research, we observed what they were doing, we went off, we did research, and we said, well, if you cryogenically froze that stuff, you could break it up and you could grind it and you could reuse it. Oh. I said, what a great idea. And they looked into it and they said, it's too costly. But then they continued thinking about it, and they realized they didn't have to actually freeze it. They could just lower the temperature with a much cheaper process. And it worked, and that's what they do.
What were they doing with the waste plastic before that? Just throwing it away?
Just throwing it away. So now they had new product that they could use to replace virgin, which reduced the need to make new plastics, and it saved the company a lot of money.
So you're working with the company as an advisor rather than an enforcement officer.
That's right.
And trying to prevent problems rather than punishing people or companies later.
That's right. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, wow, assistance is great. Let's stop enforcing because we can just do assistance. Yeah. And that's a sort of an opportunistic anti-environmental response to the success of these programs. And it's a very bad response, because what happens is that you then use the successive assistance to reduce resources to enforcement. But in fact, people need both.
Sure.
EPA did an evaluation of the population out there that is regulated, let's call it the regulated population, in the 90s, and they came up with this division into categories. They said maybe less than 25%, maybe even less, are real recalcitrants. About half would do the right thing if you help them to do the right thing. And then about another 25% are leaders. And they're very responsible, and they want to advance environmental progress as well as their own bottom line. And so it's really only the 25% that needs serious enforcement. The 50% in the middle just needs the hint of enforcement, and they'll be motivated to do the right thing. Right. And the corporate leaders don't really need anything. They actually don't even need the assistance. It's the people in the middle who need the assistance. Right. Although I do have to say, we spent a lot of time helping corporate leaders because they wanted to do even better than they were doing.
So that goes against a common perception of corporations as a whole being recalcitrant in this regard, not often not caring too much about environmental concerns. In fact, there are quite a few that do.
That's exactly right. And I spent my career with the state working with really good people. And I came into this job as what I used to refer to as a rabid environmentalist.
Okay.
Accustomed to thinking that industry is just filled with polluters. And I didn't know how well this was going to go and whether I was going to enjoy it.
Sure.
I was quite amazed to find so many people who wanted to do the right thing. And I would say the majority of people want to do the right thing and need help finding it out. Picture yourself coming into the office in the morning and you've got like 10 zillion things coming across your desk. You've got production problems. You've got the fact that it's difficult to make payroll. You don't really have the time to sit there and go, hey, can we find an alternative to chemical X?
Right.
So they need that help.
Yeah. Are you able to name any companies who seem to be doing it right? Large companies who you happen to know are doing a good job environmentally?
That's a really great question because when I first started this work, people said to me, first of all, you won't find any opportunities because people in business are expert money hunters. So if there's some money to be saved, they would have found it.
Yeah.
And my answer now is that they don't typically hunt in this part of the forest. So they need help getting over there and looking at these things. But also, people said to me, once they find money-saving opportunities, they won't share them because they'll be a business advantage. And that did not turn out to be true for many companies who are public-spirited. First of all, they want to share the information as a case study because it looks good.
Yeah.
And it is a selling point.
Yeah.
There are corporate partners who want to be responsible who will then respond to that. So we have OTA's published dozens of case studies. So if you look up Massachusetts Office of Technical Assistance and case studies, you will find them. And,
okay.
I could mention one right now, which is the people who make the Malden Mills burned down, and then it was bought by Polarfleet.
Yeah,
Polartech.
they make the stuff that they make fleece out of.
The fleece, right? Yeah, Polartech. Yeah, they have done a terrific job working with us. In fact, we worked with Malden Mills before then, before it burned down. I was sorry we couldn't get in there and help them with that, but their process was proprietary, so they actually kept us out of some of that factory. But they were trying their best to be responsible. They had a very good team. And when Polartech bought them, they bought the facility, they continued that effort. So what's interesting is that about, 7 years ago or so, Patagonia said to all of its suppliers, we want you to get certified by Blue Sign, which is a new textile sustainability standard out of Europe. And Polartech was able to get certified almost instantly because of the toxics use reduction work they had already been doing.
Oh.
So that was an enormous commercial advantage for them. They maintained that business relationship.
Fantastic. In the big picture, how do you think things are going environmentally? Global warming, of course, is a huge issue, unless it really is a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese to cripple our productivity, which I don't think is the case. Is the world getting better in some ways environmentally?
Well, what's interesting is that because of the news about the current dismantling of our regulatory protections that is being implemented by this administration, the amazing amount of progress that's happening in many other fronts, such as what I just said about new standards that companies are developing, or say eco-purchasing, environmentally preferable purchasing. which is very big in building materials, as one example, or LEED architecture. And the Living Building Standard, I would say, is even more remarkable than LEED. But LEED is new, and it's now widespread everywhere. I would like things stronger, Living Building Standard.
I believe that
tremendous progress.
Yeah, we had a woman on from Shire, the pharmaceutical company who's here in town, and their buildings, or at least one of the buildings, meets those standards, and she was pleased to talk about that.
Yeah, and then there's tremendous awareness too. I worked decades ago on trying to get people to think about indoor air quality and its impact on people.
Yeah.
And productivity. We were talking about productivity earlier.
Yes.
And there's growing awareness of that now. There are new studies which show that they have a remarkable effect. And now people are saying, well, our schools should have good indoor air quality because our students will perform better. And our factories should. Our offices should. So our workers will perform better. Right. This is a new consciousness. This is the sort of thing that we should be celebrating as progress. We're learning how to make the transition to sustainability. That's one of the reasons, I think, that we're seeing this terrible attack on environmental protections. I think of it as the last gasp of the dying dinosaurs trying to hold on to their old feeding habits. And they're asserting their power to keep things the way they are. And they have great power, and I don't know how long this struggle will last. But I don't think that it's the whole story. And what we're seeing right now from this administration, I think, can be overcome with greater consciousness of the possibilities that lie before us.
Mm-hmm. What was your opinion in particular of the leader of the EPA who just left, Scott Pruitt, and his priorities and views?
Well, of course, he was simply a dismantler. And he was doing that as quickly as he could. And he was doing it very sloppily so that many of his actions are challenged in court. So there's a legal principle in our system whereby you have to go through a process if you want to deregulate. And where does that come from? It comes from the idea that authority in a democracy lies in the people, who elect representatives to Congress. So Congress is the sovereign representing the people's sovereignty.
Right.
Who's the president? He's just a person who executes the law. Right. He does have the ability to sign or veto law, but that's his sole legislative function. Okay. And he's not supposed to be a king. And Congress right now is held by partisan concerns, and they've essentially forsaken their role as representing the people, and they're holding on to their partisan power through their executive. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So the courts have the responsibility to ensure that the Constitution is a real thing. So they have been overturning some of his actions. I'm worried about Andrew Wheeler, who has long experience with the workings of government and is not so taken with his own personal religious beliefs as Scott Pruitt was as to foolishly move forward. He will be far more of a threat because he is very much in the pocket of the chemical and fossil fuel industries, as was Scott Pruitt, but he's far more clever.
Clever can be dangerous.
We're in a very dangerous situation now. And people need to understand a couple of things. First of all, they need to understand this is their government. It's supposed to work for them. As Abraham Lincoln said, government of, by, and for the people. Not a government of, by, and for the large corporate powers. So that's the first thing that they need to understand. The second thing they need to understand is that there have been a number of dangerous myths that have been propagated which feed the political will to allow the dismantling and serve the corporate powers. And one is that it's better for those who have power to remain in charge, that's good for the consumer, that's good for the economy, that's good for everyone. It's actually not. They're actually very inefficient. We talk about efficiency, but there's something economists talk about called bounded rationality, and that means that Everything seems rational within your limited context. And within the context of the corporation's interests, what they do is rational. Now, who cares about that? The investors.
Sure.
But everything else is external to that. And everything else that's external to that is the actual world.
Right.
What they are talking about maximizing efficiency for is artificial. But what's real is getting impacted. And if we want to talk about efficiency, we need to talk about what preserves the world that we want to have. And that means we can't regard it as external to anything. It is the actual reality we need to protect.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that people think we can't afford environmental regulation. We can't afford environmental protections. The myth that it costs too much has taken over our political consensus.
You hear that all the time.
Right. It's a very damaging idea, a very inaccurate idea. In fact, environmental regulations have produced benefits that far outweigh their costs. And one of the great proponents of cost-benefit analysis, who was put in charge of doing them for the government by George W. Bush, was a man named John Graham. And when he was put in charge of what was the Office of Management Budget Office that looks at cost-benefit analysis, environmentalists went crazy. They said, oh my God, he's a cost-benefit analysis guy. He's going to come out with studies that show environmental regulations cost too much. Well, he produced a study of the Clean Air Act that showed that its benefits are hundreds of times more than the costs. And that's the most frequently complained of regulation.
He must have surprised a lot of people.
He surprised a lot of people. He turned out to be a man who actually did the cost-benefit analysis relatively accurately. I would have put it at thousands of times because I don't think he assessed all the qualitative benefits accurately. But just looking at the numbers that he had, he did it right. And and people have missed that. That the guru of cost-benefit analysis showed this.
I hadn't heard about that myself.
Yeah. Now, if you look at the Department of Commerce's report, The Costs of Regulation, which they put out early in this administration, you'll see that all they talk about is the cost. They don't even consider the benefits. It's just a completely one-sided analysis. And that's because they can't do it. If you actually did it, it won't come out that way.
I see.
So they did a cost-benefit analysis that was only costs.
I see. So what we're talking about in layman's terms, which are the only terms I understand, frankly, is externalization. Is a corporation might pollute because that saves them money, but the pollution goes out into the world. You end up with dirty air or a polluted river that eventually needs to be cleaned up. That costs money as well. And if it hadn't been polluted in the first place, we could have saved some money through things like healthcare, not needing to spend money to clean it up and things like that. Is that essentially the gist of it? That's
part of it, but it's even more than that.
Okay.
So let me give you an example. Nuclear power is something people talk about a lot because they don't, without looking at the entire life cycle of the production of nuclear materials, it seems like it's carbon neutral.
Yeah.
If you actually look at the production of uranium and all of those things that you need, it's not at all carbon neutral.
Okay.
But just thinking about the operation of the nuclear power plant, they use this immense amount of water to cool things down.
Yeah.
Amory Lovins, who is a really interesting figure, the guru of renewable energy, he wrote The Soft Path in the late 70s, contrasting renewables with the hard path, nuclear and fossil fuels.
Okay.
He said that nuclear power was like cutting butter with a chainsaw. Because you heat this stuff up to this incredible degree to make steam.
Right.
It's excessive.
Yeah.
And so they have to then draw all this water to cool it. And then they feed water, warmed water, back into the river. So now we are living in an age where nuclear power plants have to shut down because the water they're putting back into the river is too hot.
Okay.
And everything is so hot, you can't do that anymore.
Okay.
Which means that even if it was a carbon neutral technology, we couldn't count on it to be used.
Especially as the Earth warms. Is that true?
That's right.
Okay.
So, but I think, just moving off of that to talk about energy for a minute.
Sure.
We need to think in terms of a new model of how we make and use and distribute energy. You can have a solar panel on your house now, and you can feed electricity back into the system.
Right.
But it's a system that was built for that one-way feeding of electricity from a big power plant to you. Now, what's so great about that? Only certain people who can put together huge piles of money can make such a thing. So it's an investment opportunity for people who already have lots of money.
Right.
They get to make the big power plant, and then it's a cash cow. Once it's made, they just feed that power to you and collect the money from that on.
Sure.
So this new model, where you and I both have panels on our roofs, and we feed it into a system that shares it around with batteries so that we don't have to worry about it. The sun is not always there.
I'm always confused when someone criticizes solar by saying the sun's not always out because we have these things called batteries. But anyway.
No, you should be confused. That's the persistence of the propaganda that is happening there.
Yeah.
That requires a new system. But those who have invested in that one-way system have a business interest in inertia, in not seeing change and in keeping it the way it is. We are seeing that struggle happening right now. There's a rally at the State House tomorrow at noon.
Oh.
I don't know when this will be broadcast.
I'm not sure either, but it might not be that quickly.
Okay. So there's a rally Tuesday, July 17th.
17th.
Yeah, at noon at the State House to protest the current policies which are keeping the current system in place. So the legislature is not moving quickly to create the new shared system that we need, where we can tap everyone's resources. If we did that, not only would your energy bills be lowered, not only will we have the health benefits of not having to depend on fossil fuel, we could rapidly scale up many clean sources, but we would also provide jobs. And the solar revolution that started to happen under Governor Patrick, created something like 15,000 jobs. Those have already gone down to something like 12,000 jobs. Mm-hmm. I may not have the numbers exactly right, but we've already seen this huge dip because this governor is not continuing that revolution. Now, a lot of people don't realize this. They think he's doing a great job for clean energy because he's supporting offshore wind. Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. I'll give him credit for that.
Yep.
Not enough.
Yep.
He's helping to block the development of this new grid where we all share in a system that is actually for the public benefit.
I was at a candidates forum here in town a few days ago, and I saw you there. I believe you had helped to vet some of the questions. And one of the topics was distributed energy. Is this the very thing you're talking about now?
Yes.
With multiple sources of energy, including solar on rooftops, things being fed back into the system?
Right.
Okay. So that is, in fact, what we're talking about. And
here's another aspect of that. It's far more resilient. So if you then incorporate something called microgrids, you can when the power system goes down, you can isolate where you are from that and use your batteries to keep operating.
Right.
So we need not be subject to our systems going down in storms. We can create a far more resilient system.
It always seems so odd to me that a large snowstorm can take out power to, huge regions. People suffer for days. Right. I'm not sure why that should still be the case at this point in time.
It need not.
Yeah.
So the phrase grid modernization needs to be on everyone's lips.
Okay. Good to know. Anything else you'd like to touch on? We've got a couple of minutes left here. The time has gone by remarkably fast, but please.
There is something that I have a blog called The Environmental Citizen. I wrote a book called Developing Sustainable Environmental Responsibility. It's an electronic book by a publisher called Trinity, and they gave me a blog to talk about the same topics because they want the book to sell.
Yeah, I looked at it. It's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure what interesting means, but...
Let's put it this way. I learned some things. That's what I meant by interesting.
Yeah, what I'm going for is, it's amazing.
Well, of course it is. That goes without saying.
Anyway, for the blog, this morning's blog, I wrote about the folly of burning our forests. So
Okay.
people are now looking to wood pellets as a preferable source of fuel to
Yeah.
coal. And, you could look at, geez, wood burns a whole lot more cleanly than coal. However, you have to burn a lot more of it to get the same energy that you would from coal.
Okay.
And unfortunately, and while burning wood waste is okay, let's say you were just going to throw all this stuff in the trash. Instead of throwing it in the trash, you found a use for it. That'd be fine.
Yeah.
But if you go out into the forests and you start taking what they call as, these are junk trees or whatever, you're removing carbon sequestration devices. I don't know if you've heard what the coal companies want. The coal companies want carbon storage and carbon utilization techniques so they can keep doing coal. They want to capture some of the emissions, and they want to find ways to pull carbon out of the air so they can keep doing what they're doing. So that's big in our discussion. There is no better device for carbon sequestration or pulling it out of the air than a tree.
A tree is essentially just a big lunk of carbon, isn't it?
That's what it is.
Yeah.
They take carbon dioxide out of the air and they make it into wood.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more effective, and we will never come up with anything better than that. And we need not just to switch to clean sources, but we need to also to keep these things pulling carbon out of the air, or we'll never get to where we need to go. So we need to not cut down our forests to make wood pellets. And unfortunately, in the European Union, Britain in particular, but also Poland and Spain, are moving towards pellets. And who's the greatest producer of them? United States.
Oh.
They're already starting to clear-cut forests in the southeastern United States to serve that market. This is a huge mistake. And they're putting across the myth that it's carbon neutral, because for every tree we take down, we plant one.
Sure.
You take down a growing tree and you plant a sapling, and you create this sterile plantation forest that is not a real ecosystem.
It's a monoculture if it's all the same kind of tree.
You can see the hellish world that we're facing if we don't counter this myth.
Okay. I'm afraid we'll have to end on that thought, but I hope people take a look at your blog. This is fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I hope you'll come back. I think there's a lot more we can talk about that people would really enjoy learning more about.
I hope so.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, Rick. It's been In Conversation. We've been speaking with Rick Reibstein. Thank you for watching.